Mila Falsa. My name is Cleanna, Business Development Manager for New in the Mara, a dedicated marine innovation development centre. On today's Innovator Insight, we have Cindy Wilcox, co-founder of Marine Bioenergy. Marine Bioenergy is an innovative startup in the US with a patent technology to use low-cost underwater drones to tow kelp farms into the open ocean. It dives to deep depths to absorb nutrients and surfacing to absorb sunlight. Let's hear some more from Cindy. Thank you, Cindy, for coming and having a chat with us today on Innovator Insight. So I believe you're going to show us through your presentation and talk to us about your company.
Yes, thank you for having me, Clean. I'm so happy to be here. Our company is Marine Bioenergy, and we're looking at kelp for carbon neutral energy. So one of the things we know is that about a third of all energy is used as liquid fuels, especially for trucks, planes, and ships. And land and fresh water are in short supply in many parts of the world if we want to use land and fresh water to make biofuels. It's very difficult to solve long-haul shipping with wind and solar panels and batteries. So the oceans cover more than 2/3 of the globe, and the oceans are mostly empty. But one of the challenges is that the open ocean doesn't have nutrients in the top layer. So it doesn't support photosynthesis in the top layer, but there's plenty of nutrients down below the thermocline where the water's cold. So we know that kelp grows near shore, but that's where the nutrients are rolled up as the ocean currents hit the coastlines. So we know we can grow kelp, but it's difficult to grow it out in the open ocean. So Marine Bioenergy and one of the founders, Cindy Wilcox, had this idea that we could surface the kelp during the day to absorb sunlight and submerge the kelp at night to absorb nutrients. And also, once we're submerging kelp farms, we can submerge below storms and passing ships. So that's our idea. So we have this brand new idea to surface and submerge farms out in the middle of the ocean away from the busy coastlines. So the coastlines are already spoken for in most countries. So giant kelp in California is one of the fastest growing plants at 1 to 2 feet per day. And it also helpfully absorbs CO2, which is useful. It's relatively easy to process into carbon neutral fuels because brown kelps have very little lignin and little cellulose. And by the way, any country can grow their native kelp on this farm platform. So you probably have other native kelps that are different than our giant kelp. And then the kelp harvest in California is non-destructive. So you cut it by the haircut method, and then the base of the kelp keeps growing. So the farm can be productive for many years. So this is an example of what a kelp farm might look like when it's towed. This is a long line, towed by a drone submarine, gets dark, goes down at night to the depths and absorbs nutrients. And then, it stays down there for a while and then it surfaces. And it does that again and again. And the kelp grows and grows. And then eventually after 90 days, this kelp can be harvested. So that's the idea of the kelp farm, and it's away from the coastline, so it's out at the congested areas.
Okay, and that is the technology that you have a patent on?
Yes, that's a technology that we've patented, and it can be very helpful around lots of countries because so many of our coastlines are so busy. This takes it out away from the coastlines. So we received an award from the U.S. United States Department of Energy and an agency called ARPA-E. And they gave us $3 million to test the concept because after all, how do we know the kelp will grow if you take it down to the depths under pressure in the cold? And the kelp grew really well. It had no problem absorbing nutrients in the middle of the night. And because it got nutrients every day, it grew much faster than the controls that were positioned in the native kelp bed. So of course, the controls in the native kelp bed, they grew their normal rate, which is 3.5% a day, which is a fast growing kelp. But our kelp grew even faster because it got nutrients every single day. And for whatever reason, along the coast of California, some days there's nutrients and some days there aren't. So the kelp in the test kelp system grew really fast.
Okay.
And thrived. So it wasn't a problem that the kelp was depth cycled. And so that was a really encouraging result. And the university team that we work with, they published the results in a peer-reviewed journal. Very excited about that. So in the meantime, we've been talking to people about, well, how are we going to use this kelp? And one of the BASF has said, well, we definitely need feedstock to make chemicals and possibly fuels. And then we have a big digester here in California that said, we can digest the kelp. And they tested it in their bench scale. And the kelp performed as well or better than lawn and garden cuttings and then the agricultural waste that they were already digesting. So the kelp can be put into a digester to replace natural gas, and then that gives you an all green methane, right? So now you have a renewable methane, and to run your grid on days of low sun or low wind. And then also another company, Primary Ocean, has approached us for kelp to make fertilizer, basically an organic biostimulant. And kelp is also high in potash, which right now potash is in short supply due to the war in the Russian war in Ukraine. So anyway, there's lots of things we can do with kelp. So how does the business model work? So the business model, we're going to hire contract manufacturers to build the drone submarines and equipment we need for the kelp farms. We're going to sell kelp for feedstock for commercial use. After we get some experience with these kelp farms, we want to license the drones and floats and ship them off to other companies and countries. We've received several licensing requests to date, mostly from Pacific Island nations. The Pacific Island nations usually don't have their own fuel sources, and they also are acutely aware of raising of the increase in the increase in tides and the increase in sea level. So anyway, so our goal is to then manage our own farms and manage the ocean traffic control so the farms don't run into each other, and to avoid storms and make sure the farms are all in time for the harvest stations. So big question we get is, how much kelp do you need to make fuel? And so in talking to our sponsor, the U.S. Department of Energy, we've decided to characterize it as, to replace the transportation fuels in the U.S., we'd need to farm an area of 220,000 square kilometers. Now that's an enormous area. That's not a small state. That's about the size of a western state called Utah. But there's room in the Pacific Ocean for 705 Utahs. And what we find is that we ourselves have trouble grasping how big the oceans are, and that we just need one Utah to replace 10% of transportation fuels. There's lots of space in the oceans and in all the oceans. So there's plenty of room out there for all of us to farm for renewable fuels, or to farm for feed and for animal feed and human food too, if you want to farm those species. So our collaborators include the University of Southern California. They have a research lab out on an island, Catalina, and they also do hybrids at one of their laboratories. And then Kelsa Marine is doing modeling of the open ocean farm dynamics, and Glosson is the naval architect and marine engineer for the drone submarine system. So we're working right now to raise funds. We're a startup ourselves. We're working to raise funds to build and test the first farm, and continuing to test upcycling. And then we're also looking to hire staff, senior management in business development and marine engineering. So in closing, we need to replace all the fossil fuels that we're using worldwide, both for transportation and for the electrical grids. We know that land use and fresh water are controversial, so we can't do that all with land crops. We need to turn to the oceans. And so marine bioenergy can close this gap and help produce all these carbon neutral fuels that we need from kelp farmed in the ocean. And we're really looking forward to working with teams in the US and internationally. And this is our contact information. So anyway, we'd love to work with you all. And we'd be ready in a couple of years. We've got to test our first farms and get them deployed. And then we'd love to work with people in Ireland to deploy farms in Ireland. It would be awesome.
Okay, wow, it's a really interesting and innovative concept, especially the cycling side of things. My first question would be, where did the initial idea stem from?
Well, it developed over a number of years. So my husband is Brian Wilcox. His father is Howard Wilcox. So Dr. Howard Wilcox worked for the U.S. Navy for decades as a civilian scientist. And the Navy became concerned during the oil embargoes in the 1970s. So there were these oil embargoes in the 1970s. There were long lines for fuel everywhere. And the Navy said, we can't depend on imported fuel to, run the U.S. Navy. And so they started asking their scientists, and particularly Dr. Wilcox, to research alternative energy. And also because they were aware that climate change was going to be a problem by the 1970s. And so Dr. Wilcox took them this idea of growing kelp in the open oceans. But at the time, drone submarines and drones in general just weren't viable. You know, the electronics and everything didn't support it. So he had the idea of upwelling the nutrients, because they already knew that there were no nutrients in the surface of the ocean. So they had these enormous, almost like jet engines that were going to upwell nutrients. And they didn't build them, but they modeled them and they planned them and they did a bunch of research on it. And it was very capital intensive. And then, so in the meantime, the oil embargoes ended and people went back to using petroleum. So the ideas were planned, and these were huge farms and capital intensive, and they couldn't submerge them during storms. So they had to be incredibly robust. And our farms have to be robust, but we can submerge under storms. So there's a limit to how robust our farms have to be, because we can get out of the way. And so in the meantime, Dr. Wilcox passes away, and my husband goes to work many years ago, 40 years ago, for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which sends rovers to Mars. So he's been sending rovers to extreme environments all his professional life. And the ocean is another example of an extreme environment. And so he's been thinking about his dad's idea, because he knows that we need to go to the oceans to farm, or we aren't going to be able to close the energy gap. And he realizes that maybe the thing to do is to merge the drones with the farms. And instead of upwelling water, we take the farms down to the nutrients, because the upwelling just wasn't going to work that well. It's capital intensive, and also the upwelled water tends to leak away and not nurture the plants as much as you would hope. So he had this idea of, let's try this. And we talked to a number of marine biologists, and some of them said, I don't think this is going to work. And others said, it's really worth testing. And we tested it, and it worked, and the kelp thrived. So it's been a very exciting breakthrough. So now that we know the kelp thrives, we can deploy farms, right? We've got the biology. Now we need to get the technology going. But basically, the technology exists. Drones already exist. We need to get them built for this cause, but the idea of drones exists.
Okay, wow. And in relation to, I suppose, your initial test, how far out from the coastline did you go for it? Was it conducted? Yeah.
So I'm sorry. So ask me that question again.
For your initial test that you did for the drone cycling, or for the kelp cycling, how far from the coastline did that test occur?
We were just a couple of miles from the coast, but we were off an island called Catalina. So Catalina is a mountain like this. So it drops off really fast. And the marine biologists have these Niskin bottles, which are very clever cylinders, and they can drop them in the water and do water sampling like every 10 meters. So we knew before we positioned our test that there were no nutrients in the surface water. So they were testing regularly. They tested regularly before we started the test. Then we put a big test rig in place called the kelp elevator. Actually, it's a big buoy. Somebody dubbed it the kelp elevator. We didn't think of that name, but it stuck. And so the kelp elevator lowers the kelp at night and raises it during the day on an automated winch, and then sends all this data back to us every hour by email, so we know what's going on. And then the marine biologists went out regularly with these Niskin bottles, which date back to, like, I don't know, 1850 or something, and did water sampling, so that we knew that there were nutrients at depth, but not in the surface water. So it was in quite deep water. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Fantastic.
That was really important. Good question.
Okay. That's very interesting. And looking at the technology, that's one key element that you have to explore just yet. In terms of capital investment, will it be a significant cost in terms of the drone for the cycling?
You know, it's a little too soon to say what the drones will cost, but there will be a startup cost, like buying a tractor for a farm. It'll be, it's in some ways, it's like having a tractor. It's like having a boat. And then you deploy the drones. We're arranging it so we can deploy the drones from a harbor, and then assemble the farm right near a beach, for example, the long lines, and then have the drone dive right away underneath the shipping traffic and get out to sea, and also harvest out at sea. So that we're not too close to the ports, and then just bring the kelp back, or in the long term, process at sea, do pre-processing at sea, so you aren't even bringing all the kelp back, possibly. Depends on what your product is. If your product's food or animal feed, you might want to just bring the whole thing back. One of the things that's been widely discussed in the US, at least in the kelp and seaweed business, is farming asparaginopsis in order to reduce the methane output of cattle, right?
Yeah.
And so that could be very popular in Ireland and in Europe. And so if the Irish farmed all the asparaginopsis for Europe, that could be a great crop for, Ireland and Europe, right, to ship into Europe. So, and it just takes a few percent of asparaginopsis mixed into cattle feed to completely change the methane output of cows.
Yeah, wow,
I mean,
fantastic.
for
So
people who want to continue eating meat, that's an asparaginopsis is a red seaweed. And so it'd be very interesting to test asparaginopsis on the depth cycling farm, but it's quite possible to work fine. So that could be an early crop and something with a lot of demand.
Okay,
And, I mean,
wow.
I'm personally planning to continue drinking milk and eating cheese, and so
Yes, right. And looking at the biofuels element of it, how much, I suppose there's an awful lot of research that was carried out in the past 20 years in terms of microalgae. What is the current state in terms of macroalgae and using that? Could you give us a little bit of an overview?
Well, lots of people have looked at macroalgae, and there's a couple of ways to process it. If you want to make liquid fuels, you can ferment it in the same way that you ferment corn and get ethanol.
Yes.
And one of the reasons people like ethanol, at least in the US, is there's a regulatory approved method to get from ethanol to jet fuel. So in addition to, so getting to jet fuel seems to be a premium right now. So there's a method for doing that with the brown kelps. And so that's important. And then you can make bio oils by something called hydrothermal liquefaction, which has been particularly pioneered in Denmark. Bio to Oil and Steeper Energy are both European companies that have pioneered a lot of hydrothermal liquefaction to make fuels. And so they're licensing their technology all over the world. And Bio to Oil actually makes containers, makes a system that fits on a container that you ship in a shipping container. So if you had a remote area that's used to importing diesel, they could just have a shipping container to make bio oil and use bio oil to replace a lot of their local fuels like heating oils. So that's an interesting idea. So there's a number of companies that are researching how to turn feedstocks, and including macroalgae, into liquid oils. So I mentioned earlier digesters. Digesters tend to make a methane gas that's injected into the pipelines, and that replaces natural gas. And that's really important because eventually we want to get off natural gas and make it all renewable, right? Renewable energy. And that's all these are very seamless because we're all using natural gas now. And if the natural gas in my pipeline that's feeding my heater and my stove just turned into green methane, I would never even know. And so it just makes it very seamless to the user. Pretty soon 30%, kelp-based natural gas, methane, then it's 50%, and then it's 80%. And it's great when it's seamless to the user. The easier we can make it to the user, the better. Some of those methane molecules can also be turned into methanol, which is a valuable product for the chemical industry and for making other fuels. So there's a number of routes to use the feedstocks. What we're really short of is feedstock. The US government has a study called the Billion Ton Study, where they're looking for how they can get to 1 billion tons of feedstock. And I think it's really important that kelp contribute to that 1 billion tons. And certainly Ireland, with the big oceans all around, kelp is a great option.
100%. Wow, it's fascinating, I suppose the innovation that you're driving. What are the next steps for the company? You mentioned, I suppose you're looking at a funding round, potentially hiring business development manager.
Yes. As you well know, those are all the steps, right? Because you train people for that. And that's exactly what we're working on. So we're getting all our documents together. We're talking to investors. The Department of Energy is offering us some money, but last time they gave us the money under contract. This time they're offering us the money, but only if we have investor matching funds.
Yes.
So we are definitely working on finding investors to match those funds and to build the first farm and to hire. And so, as you would expect, we're developing a company, and very excited about next steps.
Okay, wow. Thank you so much for sharing, Cindy. You're really, really innovative and interesting story and company. If anyone wants to get more information, I assume going to your website is the best bet.
Yes, and that last slide has my direct email address. So I'd love to hear from somebody that's interested in working with us. That would be awesome. And yes, we're looking for, we'd love to work internationally. And I think, all together we can be part of the solution on climate change and food and feed. There's tremendous opportunity out there. And thank you so much for having us, Cleena. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. We'll talk to you soon. We'll keep an eye out for the further developments.
Oh, thank you so much. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Innovator Insight. I hope you found Cindy's interview and presentation of benefit. To remind you, Nua na Mara is a dedicated marine innovation development centre based in the Gaeltacht regions, where we aim to support marine companies, SMEs, or individuals with business ideas in the marine sector to develop their concept to a commercial reality, with various supports along the way. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos and to our mailing list to hear about upcoming events and news.